Hello, I'm John Butler. I've just been asked about what is the unconscious mind, what is the subconscious mind. And sometimes we put the two together and we just call it subconscious or unconscious, and we can talk about different levels of the mind, different levels of subconsciousness, and so on. Now, if we think of the logical, rational, conscious mind, it's the mind in which we're using every day to navigate a lot of what we do with the world, to be able to be intentional, to focus our attention, direct our thinking to different kinds of topics, the things in the environment, and we can think rationally about them. We can imagine things then based on that, where we say, oh, I'm going to now go and get a cup of tea, and of course, imagination is a lot more than just, well, I have now an intention to do something. What we describe to be the realm of the subconscious is all of those things, including the deeper levels of imagination, the deeper levels of emotion, the deeper levels of the mind generally. And that includes things like intuition, which is knowing without previous knowledge. It's a very simple definition of that. So what we're looking at are all that realm of mental functioning that is not purely logical, rational, what we often call the intellect. And so the terminology is a bit unclear often how people are using these things, and sometimes hypnotists say we're programming the unconscious, and is that clear to us exactly how far into the mind we're going with our programming and so on? Well, because much of it is poorly characterized, it's difficult to determine exactly what level of the mind we're engaging. To keep it simple, my best way of looking at this, the simplest way at the beginning at least to study it, is the conscious, logical, rational thinking. I've just mentioned a bit about that. The subconscious, the first layer back from conscious thinking, is more like our, I suppose, RAM in the computer, random access memory. We can search a bit to find information that's not immediately in our conscious mind and say, yeah, I remember that, I know that happened, and so that's available to us without too much trouble. And then we have the deeper levels of the mind, which we're calling more deep subconscious or unconscious, where dreams may emerge from at that level of our mind. It's more like the very basement of the mind, as one might say, and very buried thoughts and feelings can be there. They're often of an automatic nature in the way they affect us. We don't always know why we're doing something, but we feel a pull, a tug towards that. And it might be just to eat the wrong foods. It might be a certain pattern of thinking that comes up within us again and again, and we don't know where it comes from. And of course, the whole purpose of hypnotherapy is to make us aware of our deeper mind, to use its power, to be able to understand what's going on down there in that deeper level and be able to change it. Now, if we look at conventional psychology's approach to this, in the cognitive field, they've very much been investigating the subliminal information processing goes on in the mind. And because those stimuli are often of a rather weak and artificial nature, low intensity by definition as it were, the effects then you get in that research tend to show weak effects, that that we can be influenced at the conscious level by that kind of subliminal information, but it isn't very powerful a lot of the time. Now, part of the problem with that kind of research is that the things that matters to us in our survival and in our lives are often not those kind of stimuli that's used in priming experiments, which is often very artificial. So that can skew the results. Part of the problem, of course, within the psychological study of the unconscious, that there's a great bias towards conscious thinking because our society and culture puts a lot of emphasis on that. It's as if to say it's the master of everything, and yet as we see in life, often that's not the case. Many people would say, I shouldn't smoke. And at the intellectual, rational level, they can give you maybe 50 reasons, if they think about it, why they shouldn't smoke. And yet, they will continue to smoke despite all of that rational, logical thinking. So, the subconscious level or unconscious level of the mind has that greater power. Interestingly, in social psychology, they've taken a more better view in a sense, because they've taken a more natural perspective on it. They've looked at how it works in everyday life, how different kind of stimuli, which we're not always aware of, but how those our mental processes are influenced by them. And we see there that if we allow our research to look at that and don't kind of skew it towards the most artificial kind of stimuli, we see that the subconscious or unconscious processes exert very powerful forces on our higher mental powers, our so-called higher mental powers. And that includes all these things that we read about in psychology, like bias and predisposition to think a certain way and do certain things. So that kind of research produces quite a different view in the academic study of the subconscious or unconscious. Now, we can look at how the stimuli that we're exposed to or experiencing internally as it comes to conscious awareness, was it initially an intentional kind of study or activity we're involved in? For example, let's say you're studying to learn to drive a car, and your conscious efforts are directed to that. Then it becomes part of your unconscious or subconscious, and you're doing it with great skill and ease, because now it's so learned or overlearned, as it's sometimes called. It is unconscious activity. Now, certain things, though, we didn't intend to engage in consciously, and yet they come into our levels of conscious awareness later on. And we might think about these different parts of the mind instead of different levels of in a building, basement, first floor, second floor, and so on, or ground floor, first floor, and so on. We can look at it more as processes that interact, which I think is actually more the way the mind is really working. Things coming up from our subconscious or unconscious do access then our kind of ordinary everyday memories and cognitive thinking, and that can feed back into the subconscious, unconscious. So there's a shifting of awareness that's going on there. And so much of the stimulus for studying the subconscious in psychology has come from the early work of hypnosis in the 19th century, where it became obvious through the use of hypnosis that people were experiencing things in their subconscious, and that was influencing them consciously and in very powerful ways, and that ideas could be put into these subconscious or unconscious which would bring about change at the conscious level of awareness and lead to changes in behavior. Freud acknowledged in his formulations of the unconscious the debt to hypnosis, because that's where he got those ideas. He was a student of hypnosis. Nevertheless, hypnosis has continued to be the most powerful way that we can show the existence of the subconscious or unconscious mind and how it influences, how we can change it for the good, where our programs, existing ideas, existing negative fixed ideas, for example, are holding us back in life. They've been programmed into us from somewhere. We can always talk about genetic influences, family influence, and so on. And at the same time, we can take over that control away from those influences to an amazing degree through good hypnotherapy. Some hypnotists talk about, hypnoidal, or the first level, and in Freudian terms, pre-conscious and then subconscious, and down in the unconscious, or more of the id, as Freud's rather negative conception of the unconscious was. He didn't really acknowledge it as a powerful force for good. When we look at the metaphysical or more transcendental and transpersonal views of the unconscious, we can see quite a different view held by people, including people from ancient cultures, the ancient history, that the power of the mind over the body, the power of the mind over the mind, that the influence of the subconscious can be brought to bear into our lives in a very positive way. And for a lot of people, up until fairly recently, in psychology and in science generally, in the hard sciences, have looked at the subconscious and unconscious in a very kind of suspicious way. Well, we don't know much about it, and for people who are very oriented in their own thinking to the conscious mind, quite a degree of rejection of the importance, the value of unconscious processes. Doesn't make much sense when you look at the history of human beings. We've always had to cope with the multiplicity of inputs coming into us and make choices, and survival reflexes which need to be very quick sometimes in a dangerous situation, which can't be processed purely through rational, logical choices. That would take far too long. And so, both at a genetic level, and you think of the unconscious so-called influences in biological evolution, how things come into us, influences towards change, towards development. This needs an unconscious mind. In neurology, we say many of the activities of the brain are subconscious or unconscious. We could not spend all of our time trying to attend to those and run those processes logically or rationally. So the more we look into the study of the subconscious, the more we're seeing a very great and somewhat, I would say still, largely unknown realm of the mind that we have as human beings yet to really understand and use. Again, hypnosis is, to all practical extent and purposes, out there in the world in the most pragmatic ways, helping people use the subconscious or unconscious forces within them, which influence our bodies and our minds in very powerful ways for health or illness. And in the hands of a skilled hypnotist, that power of our mind, and it includes all of that imagination and creative thinking, all of the ways breakthroughs and understandings can come that are a big leap, by means of which humanity may develop and evolve scientifically in other ways, that could not have come purely from a sequential, logical, rational processing of the data that had been accumulated. So it seems that this power within us is something that for many people is not being used. I've over the years used hypnosis for medical applications, surgeries, many medical procedures, and seen the amazing abilities that are there within our minds to change how our brain is interpreting situations, to interpret pain as harmless when we know what it is, and we can switch it off, be completely relaxed about pain once we train our minds enough that way, and that's self-hypnosis, which we also teach in our courses, and other bodily activities, processes and faculties can be changed with the subconscious power activating it. We know our immune system, we know many systems within us are highly sensitive to what's going on in our deeper emotions and moods, much of which is outside of purely cognitive, conscious, rational thinking, or at least difficult to connect with at the more logical, rational levels, because some of those emotional processes have deep roots. They've been there a very long time. They're very resistant to analysis intellectually and to change at an intellectual level. Again, the power of hypnotherapy is the power to connect with that element of the mind, that level, those levels of the mind, and begin to change what's going on there. So we are not the victims or passive recipients of what's accumulated in our subconscious from ourselves, from others, but that we can actually rewrite the contents of the subconscious and make a better future for ourselves. So I hope you'll look into the subject of this part of your mind, of your being, and think about it in depth, and think about learning to use it for yourself, and then thinking, how do I select the best hypnotherapy training and therapy with hypnotherapy, if that's what you need for your goals, to make necessary changes. And I hope you'll attend one of our courses which will teach you to make the fullest possible best use that we can teach you to do for yourself, for your life, and in becoming a therapist to help many other people. So thank you very much for listening and watching. This is John Butler, and I look forward to speaking with you again.